The government's always lacked reason of why Oswald wanted to kill Kennedy, and Jim Marrs is giving you the reason. We're talking about Lee Harvey Oswald and whether he was involved with the government. We're talking if Jack Ruby was involved in the government. We're talking about the grassy knoll, whether there was a shooter on the grassy knoll. He's researched all the different angles, so the angle he presents is the one that he thinks is best. All right, so the big question is, and we'll work from there, who killed John F. Kennedy?
Well, do you want to work from the details down, or do you want to start with the bottom line?
Hit me. Anyone.
Okay, 25 words or less.
All right.
John F. Kennedy, the youngest president we've ever had, and the first one born in the 20th century, was shaking up the status quo, and the status quo struck back. That's the bottom line.
All right, so he was shaking up the status quo, and the status quo being who?
The status quo being every violent and powerful faction in this country, starting with the military, coming through the CIA and the intelligence community, coming on down to the international bankers, coming into the large manufacturing defense contractors, the oil men, the Mafia, you name it. Every major, powerful, violent faction in this country, he had angered.
All right. Specifically, what problems was Kennedy presenting? I know he had, from the research I've done, I know he had some problem taking care of domestic issues here in the States. Of course, he was very successful in foreign policy.
Right. Well, to address the issues that I think were the underpinnings of the assassination, you go all the way back to the Bay of Pigs. I think the military and the intelligence communities were angered at him for not following through fully on the Bay of Pigs. There's a lot of controversy there and a lot of question. It's popularly believed that it was Kennedy's orders that withheld the second airstrike, which resulted in the defeat of the Bay of Pigs invasion. That is not absolutely clear from the record, and the argument can be made that that decision was made at a lower level, which then brings in the possibility that the success of the Bay of Pigs was undercut specifically to put Kennedy in the hot seat, so to speak. Now, moving on, we find that in '62, he forced the steel manufacturers to roll back their price increases by going and appealing to the American public. He also passed the Kennedy Tax Act of 1962, which contrary to before this, included foreign assets on taxation for international corporations. That didn't win him any favors among the big guys. Then he was also making steps to curtail the power of the Federal Reserve System. Again, that's can get you in hot water. All this was going on. He was hesitantly, but nevertheless, was becoming more and more firmly supportive of the civil rights movement. And of course, today a lot of people, particularly younger people, have forgotten the tremendous emotional involvement in that issue. That earned him some hatred too. But I'll have to agree with Director Oliver Stone. I think the straw that broke the camel's back was National Security Action Memorandum 263, issued on October the 11th, 1963, when he agreed to the measures outlined in the McNamara-Taylor report, which said we could and would disengage from South Vietnam. Okay, and in fact, I have a Stars and Stripes newspaper from about that same time period that just lays it out. It says JFK to pull out of Vietnam. And I think that was the plan. I think that was the game plan. Of course, you can argue about it today because it didn't happen. But then, of course, he was killed about a month later. And I think that was simply the straw that broke the camel's back.
All right, I want to, in this first segment, I want to make sure we set the groundwork. So why were they upset with pulling out of Vietnam if Vietnam was such a hated war?
It was only hated later on. Early on, everybody, let me put it this way, everybody was making money. And it was needed at that time because in the late 50s, about 58 as I recall, there was kind of an economic slump during before Eisenhower left office, and it caused quite a ripple across the country. People at that period of time still remembered the Depression, and they were so fearful that we might lapse back into a depression. It was just a kind of a recession. But some of the people hardest hit, though, were the military defense contractors. At that period of time, Korea was over with. There was no other real shooting war going on, and the emphasis in the military at that time was on intercontinental ballistic missiles. So some of the missile manufacturers and some of the high-tech people were still having some good military contracts, but the people that made the helmets and the boots and the Jeeps and the M1 rifles and M14s, etc., they were hurting. And they really needed this war to bolster their industries. And of course, then it spread out. All the people that worked in defense for defense contractors, suppliers. It was a very economic thing. And I'll have to tell you that during Vietnam, while on the East Coast and the West Coast there were many people protesting that war, through the Sun Belt, and particularly in Texas, and particularly in North Texas, there were corporations like General Dynamics, Bell Helicopter, Texas Instruments, I could go on and on and on, who were just, I mean, business was booming.
All right. So we have JFK is loved by the public, the common man. We have our studio audience here, and occasionally they'll be coming up to our audience participation mic to ask Jim Marrs, author of Crossfire, The Plot That Killed Kennedy, a question. So go ahead.
Mr. Marrs, you said nothing about the Cuban connection or Fidel Castro, and this is the aspect of the conspiracy that I've heard most about over the years. Could you comment on any relations that you see there?
Are you referring to the idea that Castro was behind the plot to kill Kennedy?
Yes, perhaps through the American underground or the American labor unions or something like that.
Well, first off, Castro and the American underground were just totally on opposite ends. Castro had thrown the Mafia off the island, and they did not go for that at all, especially considering the investment they had down there. So the idea that Castro was behind a plot to kill Kennedy, I think, was probably best summed up by Castro himself. He said, I would have been a fool to get involved in something like that. He said, because the thing I dreaded the most was another renewed invasion of Cuba, and that would have been the very thing that would have sparked it. And certainly after the assassination, there was a lot of talk about Castro possibly being behind this, and there was an effort to stir up the American public again to support an invasion of Cuba. But of course that never happened, and I think that gets into the details of the secret agreement after the missile crisis, when we agreed not to do that.
Did Lee Harvey Oswald fire the 3 shots? Any information you could give us on the grassy knoll shot type subject? Well,
at this late date, I don't suppose there's anybody who's really studied the case at any length, except maybe Gerald Posner, who cannot at least seriously entertain the idea that shots came from the grassy knoll. So we've got 2 shooters. That's all there is to it, and it's the only way that the shooting sequence and the whole thing can be explained. This single bullet theory is the most ridiculous thing to ever come down the pike. It is totally unsustainable, and it's not sustainable once you look at the evidence, namely the autopsy and the bullet holes in his jacket and in his shirt, which are clearly in the back, which are lower than the place where the shot supposedly exited through the Adam's apple in his throat, and none of that holds up. So there are multiple gunmen, 2 for certain, maybe more. The House acoustical scientists said that if they had test fired from other locations, they may have established that there were shots from places other than the grassy knoll and the 6th floor of the Scubik Depository. Now, back to your question about what was Lee Harvey Oswald's role in all this. Well, now, don't misunderstand me. Lee Harvey Oswald was not some innocent civilian who just happened to be at work one day and got tagged for the assassination. He was a low-level intelligence agent operating on behalf of the United States. He had probably been passed along to the FBI as an informer. Everybody had files on him. The military had files on him. The FBI had files on him, and nothing was ever done. There was no warning to the Secret Service. He was never picked up. He was never. He was given money by the United States government to come back from Russia. I mean, come on. And so he was involved. But the question becomes, did he actually fire a shot? And I may not be able to prove this to the satisfaction of everyone, but in my own mind, I feel fairly confident in saying I do not believe that Lee Harvey Oswald fired a shot that day. And my reasons for that are simply this. Number one, the Dallas police performed a paraffin test on his right cheek and his hand. There was no nitrates, no gunpowder on his cheek. That means he had not, and I guarantee you, knowing weapons as I do, if he had fired that loose bolt, badly put together Mannlicher Carcano or Italian war rifle, there would, and when he opened that bolt, those gases would have come out. He would have had nitrates. He would have had gunpowder all over his face. Okay, he did not. He also said, "I didn't shoot anybody." No, sir. And that statement was recorded, and in recent years, with the advent of voice stress analysis, has been subjected to that, and shows there was no stress in his voice. He was telling the truth. So where was he? There is absolutely no evidence that clearly establishes that Lee Harvey Oswald was on the 6th floor of the Scuba Depository at the time of the assassination. But what there is, when he was asked by the Dallas police, they said, "Where were you when the shooting started?" And he said, "I was in the downstairs lunchroom." And he correctly named 2 employees of the Texas Scuba Depository who indeed had been in the downstairs lunchroom eating lunch. Now, how could he possibly known they were there if he hadn't been there to see them?
All right, we'll get a little more into Lee Harvey Oswald.
Of different explanations. But then after the Roswell crash takes place on July 4th, 1947, we see the Air Force, the Army Air Forces actually, announced that they had captured a flying saucer. Within 3 hours they said, no, we made a mistake. It was just a weather balloon. We just made a mistake. Our officers at Roswell, New Mexico, the men of the 509th Bomb Group, the only atomic strike force in the world at the time, are so incompetent that they can't recognize a balloon and a radar target, but that's what it was. And then you see the articles appear on the 9th of July. The Army and Navy moved today to suppress the stories of flying saucers whizzing through our atmosphere. Why suddenly on July 9th does the government care that these stories are in the newspapers? Up to that point, they hadn't cared. And the answer is they've got one, and now they want to have an opportunity to exploit this find without having to worry about our competitors in the world.
Jim, are you saying that he was involved but didn't fire a shot, to clarify here?
I think he was involved in some plots, okay? I think he was reporting back to his intelligence superiors, never thinking for a moment that they would hang him out to dry as the patsy. And I think that when Kennedy was actually killed, and he learned of that, and I think that, in fact, you can see it on his face in the famous clip of the midnight news conference when they said, "Did you kill the president?" He said, "No, I've not been charged with that. I only heard about that from the reporters." And one of them says, "But you have been charged." And he gets this funny look on his face, and there's a hubbub, and they drag him out. He was, in his own words, a patsy.
All right. Did he know Kennedy was going to be shot that day?
That's a good question. I personally personally do not think so, and I base this on a conversation that was heard between Oswald and Ruby by a local attorney down here about a week or two before the assassination, and what he overheard them talking about. And by the way, this was he reported this, and it's on the record. He reported this prior to the assassination. He heard Ruby and a man who he later identified as Oswald, and they were talking about assassinating Governor John Connally. So Oswald may have thought, he knew there was a plot afoot, but I think he rationalized that the FBI or the CIA or somebody would come in and stop it before it came to fruition.
All right, so let's get a definite yes on this. So you are saying Jack Ruby was not just an over-patriotic citizen who killed Lee Harvey Oswald because of his heinous crime that he was in on the plot?
Absolutely not. Anybody, there's too many people who were around Dallas at that time who could put Oswald and Ruby together.
So he was not just...
He was part of the plot.
Oh.
And he himself said that. Jack Ruby is on tape saying there was a big conspiracy going on, there's a big plot going on. He said, the people in high positions who have so much to gain by this, will never let the truth come above board to the American people. That's what he said.
All right. Are there any... maybe not from the assassination shot, from behind the scenes, any things the government tripped up on that points that there was a conspiracy plot by our own government?
Well, now, let me discuss that for a half minute, because I don't want people to get the wrong idea. I do not believe that the FBI, as a government agency, plotted to kill Kennedy. I do not believe that the CIA, as a government entity, plotted to kill Kennedy. I do not believe that the military, as a total government entity, plotted to kill Kennedy. But there were elements within all of those, to include the anti-Castro Cubans that were the proteges of the CIA, and to include the Mafia, which, of course, if you want to go find somebody to kill somebody, they're the guys that have the means. All that was involved, and there was elements within all of that. And I'll tell you where it all came together was the secret war against Castro, known as Operation Mongoose, headquartered out of the Jim Wave Station on the University of Miami campus. Here was the confluence of the military, the CIA, and the Mafia, and they're all working together to kill Castro. And in my mind, I think it would have been no problem at all to simply send the hit teams to Dallas.
All right, what is yet to be explained? What still needs to be? Are there holes in the?
Well, yeah, the people that put this together were smart people, and it's taken more than 30 years to begin to even see the broad outlines of what went on. And I think, in answer to your question, what we need are the details: who actually pulled the trigger, who passed the money, where did it come from. And I'll be the first to say I'm not sure we'll ever know that. Okay, but what you have to understand is look at the broad aspects and look at the big picture. Okay, there were two conspiracies involved here. One was to kill Kennedy. It was obviously very successful. Now, who actually pulled the triggers, who passed the money, we still don't know. At best, it's in controversy, and at worst, there's gaps that we just really don't know. And because when you put together a high-level conspiracy, you're not gonna you're gonna have cutouts. You're not gonna have it all clear. The second conspiracy, however, was the conspiracy to cover up the truth of the first conspiracy, and that one has not held up as well, because we can document that at the level of Lyndon Johnson, at the level of J. Edgar Hoover, that there were activities and actions taken that suppressed evidence, destroyed evidence, fabricated evidence, intimidated witnesses, and all of this is crimes. These are all crimes. If any one of us, any one of the people in your audience, if they committed these crimes in connection with a capital murder case, they'd be thrown in jail. In fact, they would be held as an accessory after the fact, which makes them as guilty under our legal system as the person who pulls the trigger. So I can say without any qualification that the guilty parties in this case are John Edgar Hoover and Lyndon Baines Johnson, because they can be proven to have taken steps that covered up the truth of what really happened.
And I'm not sure. how accepted do you think these conspiracy theory plots are? I mean, when I think about it, I don't think of it as that outrageous, and I've come to believe it more and more.
It's nothing new. I mean, all you have to do is go back and look at the Shakespeare's Julius account of the death of Julius Caesar. Cassius, Brutus, all good and honorable men, you know, and they said we've got to move against Caesar. Not so much that we're against Caesar, but because we are more for the country. We've got to save the country, and I think that was the mentality of the people who were acquiescent in the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
I definitely think the Kennedy assassination cover-up conspiracy theory is definitely one of the more credible and believable ones.
Well, I hate to interrupt you, but it's not a theory. The documents are there. There was a cover-up. There's no question about it. For God's sakes, his brain's missing, okay, which could tell us volumes by pathology to determine how many shots and from what locations. And his brain is missing, and it was missing while in the custody of the federal government of the United States. I mean, what else do you want? And that's just one thing. We could go on and on.
So do you kind of want to pull all your thoughts together? It's been a half hour of wow.
Right. There is just so much information and so many things to talk about. In fact,
we've just scratched the surface.
Oh, we've barely even scratched the surface. I'll put it this way. You're right. It's interesting. After all this time, you'd think I'd be burned out on this, but when I really get into it, I do get kind of worked up, and it's because I feel like the little boy who tried to tell everybody that the emperor didn't have any clothes on. You know? It's so obvious. It's just there. The single bullet theory does not work, and therefore, the single assassin theory does not work, so you're left with multiple shooters, which is the truth. And that means there's a conspiracy. The fact that it's not acknowledged to this very day by the government means that they have covered up to this very day about what you know that they knew. Think of Jackie Kennedy Onassis. She had all the money in the world. She bound to have looked and to determine what went on there. And if they'd gone to her and said, Jackie, I'm sorry to report this, but it was just a lone nut, and it's just kind of an accident of history, I believe she would have said something along that line to the public, but she never has. She's never said anything. In fact, she left behind memoirs that are not to be released until her children are passed away. I mean, she knows that this was very big, very deep, very horrid, and it is something that is still, as far as I'm concerned, a cancer on the national body politic.
All right, one last question. We always hear about papers that are about to be released, and that's the first time I heard of those memoirs. How much are we going to find out when different papers get released?
Oh, I think there will be much more information to come forward in the future as more and more of the people who are actually participants in all of this die. There will be people, there's even a man now who's confessed to being the Grassy Knoll gunman, and incredibly enough, there's some physical evidence that links him to the crime, and yet you haven't heard anything about that. That's been swept under the rug because we don't want to crack this whole thing open. But I might also point out that you and your audience are in good company, because according to Webb Hubbell, that was a good close friend of Bill Clinton's, he said in 1992 Bill Clinton appointed him as a associate attorney general and sent him to the Justice Department, and he told him, he said, I want you to specifically find out two things for me. He said, I want to know who killed JFK and what's the deal on the UFOs. Isn't that interesting?
All right, and that is the perfect... Also in this 3-show series, American Conspiracy 1, featuring Kevin Randall and his expertise on the UFO phenomenon, and American Conspiracy 2 with Dr. John Morgan discussing the status of marijuana in America.